Now, moving on to this week's interview, we'll circle back to what I touched upon in today's spoken word, that sick, twisted circle of perpetual war. Raed Jarrar is the Government Relations Manager in the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy at the American Friends Service Committee. That is a hefty title, but so is his experience in U.S. Middle East relations, not least of all from his own life. Last week, we sat down with Raed to talk about the U.S. addiction to conflict in the Middle East, the systems that are keeping the war machine running, and how he, a Palestinian Iraqi-American, is working for all of his countries through diplomatic advocacy. Take a look. Okay, so we are here with Raed Jarrar, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. You're Palestinian and Iraqi, Sunni and Shiite. You lived in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq, and you specialize in U.S. engagement in the Arab world. Is there anything that we're doing right?
No. The short answer is no. I think the U.S. engagement in the Middle East at large it's been a story of failure for decades now. And whether it's regarding the U.S. indirect engagement through partners like Israel or some of the other regional countries, or whether it's through U.S. direct involvement, like what the U.S. did in Iraq in 1991 until today, or the U.S. involvement in Syria, it is a story of failure and destruction and death. That's what the U.S. role has been, unfortunately, in the region.
So, on that same note, in the book No Good Men Among the Living, Anand Gopal talks about the history of interventionism in Afghanistan and basically how they survived this sort of imperial culture by pitting sides against one another. And we have no idea what we're doing. We'll throw informants into Bagram or into Guantanamo. And essentially, the book is about how to destroy a country and make everyone hate you. And from what we've seen with the recent, there was a recent protest that got into the Green Zone in Baghdad, and you wrote a lot about this when you were living there as an architect that was trying to rebuild and seeing this on the ground. Is there any way to help at this point in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, or do we just need to get out because of our extreme ignorance of both culture and democracy?
Well, first let me point out an important detail, and that detail is Iraq and Afghanistan and other places that the U.S. has been interfering in have been destroyed because of U.S. intervention, but that wasn't necessarily because of a series of mistakes or ignorance. In many cases, that was the plan. So some of the destruction happened intentionally. Some of the destruction happened because of lack of experience. Because saying that everything that the U.S. has done was a mistake or it was because of lack of information is too generous, I think. Because many of the crimes that were committed were premeditated. And the divisions that were installed and the chaos that followed didn't all happen by coincidence. And there is an MO that we have seen repeated in different countries that the US has operated in. So that's my caveat, is that many of these things happened on purpose. The destruction that happened in many of these countries was the plan. It wasn't despite the US being there, it's because the US was there. Now, regarding what to do about that, and that's of course a huge question of like what to do now. I've been always an advocate for ending interventions in Iraq and other parts of the region, and whether these interventions came from the U.S. side, which was the majority of interventions at one moment, or whether they came from other regional and international powers. As we see now, Russia is interfering, Iran is interfering, other regional countries are interfering. So ending these interventions is actually a really important step to create space for Iraqis or Syrians or Afghans, to that matter, to work on their countries. And we've learned from experience that the US has no legitimacy or capacity at this stage to help Iraqis with nation building. Whether that happens through political means or whether it actually happens by building a bridge that has been destroyed, the US has failed to do either. physical reconstruction or social reconstruction. It didn't really work with the US. So yes, I think getting out of the way is an important step. But at this stage, getting out of the way is not very easy because of two reasons. Number one, there is a huge void there that getting out of the way will end up leading to some aspects to collapse. And more importantly, getting out of the way should also include other powers who are interfering. So it's not only about the US getting out of the way. At this stage, it's about the US helping to broker a regional or even international deal so that other parties would also get out of the way. Because only for the US to get out of Iraq and Syria will not really solve the problem that much. The destruction caused by Iran and Hezbollah and Russia and other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, everyone have their hands now in these countries. The US knocked down the doors of these states and allowed others to interfere. But where we stand now, everyone is interfering. So I would say it has to be a part of a strategy. It's not just about cutting and running, it's about a strategic end of an intervention, a strategic creation of a space where Iraqis and Syrians and Afghans and others could start collaborating to put the country on the right path.
And how would you, because we are the only people that we're quote unquote allies with in the region are Saudi Arabia and Israel, and it would really do us well to distance ourselves from those oppressive regimes and be connected in a more democratic or diplomatic way with other regimes. Is there a way to do that with this idea of removing ourselves but still trying to build these diplomatic roads? And how does that also tie into Saudi Arabia and Israel, who Israel keeps pushing this interventionism really quite hard?
I see this on two different levels. There is the strategic alliance level that you mentioned. The US has these strategic alliances in the region with Israel or with Egypt or with Saudi Arabia or even with the government of Iraq that we have been funding and training and selling weapons to for over a decade now. So there are some strategic alliances there that should be rethought. We need to rethink our relationships with many of these countries around the region and think about the US role in the region. That is on the 30,000 foot level, and I think it's important to think about it, but at the same time, we should also think about immediate policies that are happening on a daily basis. So for those, I think tactical withdrawals and rearrangements can happen with, at the same time, having reservations over some of these regional powers. We don't have to ensure that Saudi Arabia becomes democratic and transparent before we can come up with a regional deal for stabilizing Iraq or Syria. Some of the things can happen immediately, and these things that should happen immediately include us, number one, halting any weapon sales or transfers or aid to countries that have been abusing human rights. We don't have to fix them. We don't have to fly to Saudi Arabia and convince them to, not oppress women or allow women to drive. Or we don't have to go to Israel and advocate for ending the occupation. Yet, what we're talking about now is the immediate U.S. responsibility. We're sending U.S. tax dollars, money, to these countries, or we're selling U.S. weapons to these countries. And that could be stopped. It could be stopped overnight. And I think that should happen overnight. So an immediate halt of U.S. Military transfer and equipment and stuff like that, and other harmful policies that are happening. At the same time, coming up with a regional strategy for stopping interventions in Iraq and Syria. And the Obama administration was partially successful in coming with some variations of this in Syria. So we saw the ceasefire that happened this year. It's not perfect, but it's not a bad example of how the US can use its leverage with its allies, with its foes, with its other countries in the region to reach out to a ceasefire in Syria. Many people were skeptical that would ever happen because it's such a messy civil war at this stage. So the fact that the US managed to reach out to Russia and convince Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian government and the US allies in the region to reach to a point where they would stop attacking each other was impressive. And I think the same mechanisms and the same theory can be used to create a larger space. So it's not just about seizing fire, but it's about seizing interventions. And to create that space, there should be more time and effort and resources dedicated to get to that. I mean, one thing I want to give just as an example of how these ideas are always underfunded, ideas of reaching to nonviolent resolutions or diplomatic resolutions. There was a really good report that came out a couple of years ago, at the end of 2014, by the Congressional Research Service, CRS. And they looked into how much money the United States has spent on Iraq and Afghanistan since the beginning of wars, or since 9/11. The numbers are staggering, of course. They are in trillions of dollars. 1, 2, 3 trillion. God knows what that means. It's like a huge number with so many zeros, you know. But what's shocking about it is that 93% of the spending went through DOD. 93% went through the Department of Defense. And 3 or 4% went through the Department of State. And even that money that goes through the State Department is not that peaceful, you know, like Blackwater was employed by the State Department. But I'm saying as an engagement theory, imagine that as a country we're spending 93% of the money on bombs and 3% on, you know, what is supposed to be diplomacy. So ideas of reaching to a regional ceasefire or coming up with international arrangements to stop interventions will not really happen by a couple of trips. You know, there has to be investments in billions of dollars to come up with these ideas. There has to be a buy-in from civil societies. So it's like large ideas that need to be funded, and it needs a lot of capacity behind it. Unfortunately, where we stand now, the US does not have enough resources for those types of solutions because all of the money is spent on bombs.
So in that same idea, you know, there's the saying that peace just isn't profitable. Money is made through bombs and through, you know, if we were to stop drone bombing Yemen, for example, well then, but you know, there are companies that make billions of dollars off of drones. So, I mean, this diplomacy is not just something that has to go through like the Pentagon. This sounds like this has to come from a difference in thinking about how we spend money just in general in terms of allowing these big contracts to go to people like Blackwater or Lockheed Martin or people like that.
Yeah, you're right. And the fact that the US government spends huge amounts of money every year on military spending is an indication of a larger problem. So I'll give you two examples of that. One of them is the money that is decided how to be spent by Congress every year. So we have a federal budget of around $4 trillion. 3/4 of that budget is on autopilot, what we call in DC mandatory spending. And 1/4 of the budget, around $1 trillion, is discretionary spending. So this is money that Congress decides how to spend every year. Now, out of that $1 trillion that the Congress decides how to spend, the majority of the money, 57% this year, will be spent on military spending. And the rest, 43%, will cover everything else. Transportation and education and development. It is insane when you think about it, that this is how we choose as a nation to spend our money, that 57% of it goes on military spending. And that 57% is a huge amount of money. We're talking about amounts of money that are more than the 6 or 7 or 8 countries after us combined. And keep in mind that many of these countries are actually our allies. So there is no logic for the amount of money that the US spends. Actually, there are some other studies that try to look deeper into US military spending. So if you look at it at face value from discretionary spending, it ends up being somewhere in the $500 or $600 billion. But if you dig deeper and include some of the hidden military spending, an example is veteran affairs. Veteran affairs is not usually counted as military spending, but many people argue that we are spending a lot of veteran affairs because we're going to wars, and this should be a part of military spending. Or, more importantly, the national debt. So the interest that we have spent on national debt that happened because of wars is not usually calculated as a part of military spending. Anyway, if you add everything up for real, it adds up to over $1 trillion this year in 2015. It's $1,009,000,000,000, which is a staggering number. When you think about it, we're going through times in the United States where we're cutting $50 million here and $100 million here for programs feeding children or helping homeless residents of DC or other states. A few $1,000,000 here and there. So amounts of money that are being spent on war are really scary. And of course, when you spend all of this much money on war, then you need something to spend it on. And that is why this is how the machine works. It has to produce bombs, it has to drop bombs on someone, and it has to have enemies. And we don't have enemies, we have to find enemies. And I think that was one of the problems that were happening in DC a couple of years ago, because there was a real push towards reducing military spending. And then the ISIS crisis happened, and that was, of course, a lifeline to many of these weapon manufacturers or, the military-industrial complex. So they were, I think, very pleasantly surprised and happy that there is this new monster that needs more military spending and more militarism at large, because it justifies ongoing policies. So sometimes the solution to some of these micro problems and country specific issues actually have to do with our larger picture. Like, we will not be able to fix our engagement with Yemen or Syria or Iraq by just looking at that country. We need to take one step back and look at the United States theory of engagement with the rest of the world, the United States military spending at large, and larger issues that are trickling down to the level of a bomb falling in Yemen, but it actually goes back to a much higher problem of our thinking of how should we engage with the rest of the world.
And do you feel, because as somebody who spent a lot of time in the Middle East, how do you feel the acceptance of Muslim culture, just the knowledge of these different cultures? Do you feel that that's a way to start thinking about our interventionism differently? Because currently we don't see these people as people. You read that, this many people died in Afghanistan or this many people died in Yemen, and you're not taught by the media to respect them as human beings. How do you think that ties into our sort of blind interventionism in the Middle East and elsewhere?
I mean, the US went through similar cycles and phases in the past, and when the US used to engage with wars in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and Laos, and other places, Asians were dehumanized in the media, and there were these anti-Asian American sentiments here at home. Many Asian Americans paid a very heavy price of racism and anti-Asian sentiments that accompanied US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. And when the US dropped nuclear bombs on Japan, and tens of thousands of civilians were killed in each of these bombs, there was a culture that was built behind that to dehumanize the Japanese people, to make it feel like that was a policy option to kill 50,000 people with a button, because they're not as human as us. And we are seeing like that happened definitely before. It happened during eras of enslavement and discrimination against African Americans, and it is happening now again with Muslims and Muslim Americans. And Islamophobia and U.S. interventions in the Muslim world are really two sides of the same coin. So the same logic that justifies treating a Muslim American as a second-class citizen and discriminating against them here at home justifies dropping a bomb at a Muslim American abroad and killing them, because there is this culture that was created as well to justify killing Muslims outside or discriminating against them inside, because they are being viewed as second-class humans or second-class citizens. So it took a while, I think, to create this anti-Muslim sentiment. But where we stand now, unfortunately, it's worse than it was right after 9/11. And the stereotypes against Muslims have become more entrenched in U.S. mainstream narratives and cultures. So it's really problematic. And I see them both connected. And like even from my personal perspective, I was in Iraq during 2003 and 2004 and worked against U.S. wars and interventions. And when I came to the U.S. And became an American, I also worked on personal struggles or with larger campaigns dealing with issues of anti-Muslim sentiments in the U.S. You know about my T-shirt story. I mean, that's one of the issues that I was engaged with, but also with larger campaigns in the U.S. Regarding the treatment of Muslim Americans in these days.
So I want to talk about the T-shirt incident. So basically, for those of you who don't know, what happened was that you were boarding a flight at JFK, and you had a shirt on that read in Arabic and in English, "We will not be silent." And you were asked to take off the shirt or put on a different shirt after you'd already gone through security and checked out okay, obviously. And not only that, but then they didn't allow you to sit at the front of the plane even after you'd changed your shirt. They made you sit at the back of the plane, and the ACLU was involved, and it became, a big deal for good reason. So what I also found interesting is that phrase originated with the white rose in opposition to Nazi rule in Germany. And the irony is just a little too too staggering on that. So as an Arab American, this sort of the same sort of irrational fear that we saw in the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Do you see this combination of irrational fear and hate? Do you think that something like that sort of level of irrational fear and hate could come to the surface in the U.S.? Do you think that's possible? Do you think we have something in place to stop ourselves from becoming like that?
We are seeing this now. I mean, with the primary elections and the presidential campaigns, we are seeing some really scary rhetoric, not necessarily coming from candidates themselves. Sometimes people point out to some things that Trump has said or other candidates have said, but their constituents say things that are much scarier than what I've been hearing from the campaigns themselves. Yeah, whether it's Republican or Democrats in the House and Senate or presidential primaries, really ugly things have been said in the last few years about Muslims in general or Muslim Americans in particular. So I think, the saying about history repeating itself, these things happen all around the world all the time. And sometimes governments start this rhetoric to demonize a group of people just so that they can go through or pass some political objectives, but sometimes it gets out of control. And we saw how hate crimes against Muslims and Arab Americans are on the rise in the last few months. And these are all indicators of a problem that we're dealing with it as a nation. And at the same time, I think in 2016, the US is in a different place. It is more equipped to deal with the rise of fascist or racist ideologies, because these things have happened so many times in the past, and especially newer generations in the US have learned about them, and they refuse to be a part of a new wave of racism that would happen. So I think we are at a stage where we are more equipped in dealing with the rise of racist ideologies, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen.
So, final question. I'm curious because there's always this argument about, life under Hussein wasn't that bad, and then we came in and we made it so much worse. And I think it's funny to have Americans argue about this when they have no idea really. So you've lived under Hussein. You've also lived under Bush. What do you feel? Do you feel that Hussein needed to be taken out? Do you feel that living under Bush was better or worse, or can we make those sort of distinctions? And what, are there parallels between the people that lived under both of these the rulers, and how can we make those connections as the people at the grassroots level, the 99%, making connections between people under unjust rulers?
I mean, I think a more accurate way to describe the contrast of what happened in 2003 is to see it as a moment where Iraqis used to live under national rule that started in the 1920s. There were multiple Iraqi governments and rulers since 1920. And then in 2003, Iraq was taken away by foreign rule. And the contrast is between having a foreign intervention and military occupation run the country as opposed to a national government that was run by Iraqis. Now, the answer to the question, did I believe that Saddam Hussein should have been removed, is yes. But the real question there is, who should have removed him? And that's where the complexity of the situation comes, because the answer to the second question is not the US. And Iraqis have gone through many different regimes since 1920. There was a kingdom, actually, back between 1920 and 1958. There was an Iraqi monarchy that had over 10 or 11 prime ministers. Many of them were changed because of uprisings. The monarchy ended with a revolution in 58, and there was the First Republic. And the First Republic, started with a bumpy, like a few years. There was a back and forth revolutions and coups. And then there was the Second Republic in 1968. And the Second Republic had a few presidents as well, and many prime ministers. And so Iraqis managed to change many of these rulers in the last century. When the rulers got to a point where they were dysfunctional or corrupt or became dictators, there was a public mobilization that changed them. And when Iraqis did it, they did not burn their museums and loot their universities and destroy their infrastructure. They did it in a way that would remove the head of the political regime without impacting the civic part of the government. And Iraq historically was a socialist country. So the government owned, the public sector ran the country. The government owned most of the country. So, and it provided most of the basic needs to the people. When I grew up in Iraq, this public sector that was not invented or created by Saddam Hussein, it was inherited from the governments before. It was built by Iraqis, from the time of my great grandfather, And it was a very functional and very efficient system to provide Iraqis with basic services. So all Iraqis had free education, from elementary school until you get your PhD. You don't pay anything, and free healthcare for everyone. And Iraq had one of the best healthcare systems in the region. There was even during the sanctions era in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a food ration system. So the government provided basic food needs to everyone. And other things, like electricity and water and stuff, and gas. So the country was functional in that fashion. And it had a political dictatorship that was brutal. Many people paid a heavy personal price, including my family. We had many members of my extended family who were killed by the government or had to flee the country by the government. And of course, we lived under that regime, and we knew that there were limitations for expression and political freedoms. There was one party that's allowed, etc. When the US came in, the US destroyed the political system there overnight and replaced it with a system that is very bad. It's really corrupt and dysfunctional. The political system in Iraq is corrupt, it's violent, and it does not allow for freedom of expression. And this is the system that was installed by the US. It's a very sectarian system that has been destroying the country. It came with militias, sectarian militias, that have conducted one of the largest ethnic and sectarian cleansing campaigns in the region. It's the largest since the creation of Israel in 1948. Millions of Iraqis were displaced out of their homes by militias linked to the ruling parties that were brought back to Iraq by the US. But more importantly, the US destroyed the rest of the Iraqi government. The public sector that used to provide to the public, they privatized it, bombed it, destroyed it. So Iraqis, in a way, they lost that safety net that was inherited from generations before. And they didn't gain a new political freedom, What they gained is a new corrupt, dysfunctional, sectarian system that continues to collapse until this day. You mentioned the incident that happened in the parliament last week, where people broke into the green zone and took over the parliament. And there were many videos that went viral in Iraq of parliamentarians getting beaten up in the streets, parliamentarians getting attacked on airplanes because they were flooding the country to neighboring countries. People are not happy with the system. Iraq is the third or fourth most corrupt country in the world, according to Transparency International. Iraqis don't have any of the basic services that they need. There is no electricity or water that is reliable. Streets are in a bad situation. The education system has collapsed. The healthcare system has completely deteriorated. And Iraq is still one of the richest countries in the region, So the contrast between what happened before, April 2003 and after is striking in that regards, that when Iraqis had the chance to self-rule, they had problems, but they also had functional governance systems. And when the US went in and destroyed Iraq and destroyed Iraq's government, Iraqis lost both. They continue to have an oppressive regime that doesn't allow them to express their views, but they lost all of the safety networks that they used to have, all of the public sector that used to provide for them.
So I know I said final question, but this is really it. Do you think, because you were working as an architect when right before you left, trying to help people rebuild what had been destroyed by the initial occupation, Do you think you'll ever go back, or do you feel that you're? I read in an article that you had said that like you feel that by no choice of your own you've landed here, and you're trying to do good work here. So do you think you'll ever go back to continue with your architecture?
It's not an option now. I am a U.S. citizen, and I live in D.C. and my kids go to schools in D.C. So I am one of the millions of Iraqis who were displaced out of the country, and I think many of the Iraqis who were displaced farthest, like myself, their displacement became more permanent than others. Um, so, and that was always the story of my Palestinian family because I'm half Palestinian and half Iraqi. And it was always a question about the willingness for us as Palestinians to go back home in case conditions allow. We never had the option to go back home. And I feel like at this stage in 2016, I don't really have the option to go back home to Palestine. I don't have the option to go back home to Iraq either. But I am among the privileged, 1% when in that regards because, I managed to come to the U.S. and become a U.S. citizen, and I have my life going on here. For the majority of displaced Iraqis, they're waiting for the day when going back home will become an option, because they're either living in a camp or they're living in countries that did not grant them citizenships or full integration. So, I mean, for me, I tried to go back in 2010 for a couple of years. It wasn't easy to be there, and I mean, in the future, I think if it becomes an option, I might consider it to go back and work on architectural issues or political campaigns to fix it, the country. I would also consider going back to Palestine to work on campaigns of reconstruction and political campaigns if that becomes an option in the future. Meanwhile, I'm stuck in the belly of the beast, so I will do my best from Washington, D.C.
Well, we're lucky to have you, even though I can imagine it would probably be better if you were able to go back home because it would mean that those were more stable times. But thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.